The time is just gone 8:30 a.m. on this day of Jum'ah. If you have just tuned in, Jum'ah Mubarak to one and all, we welcome you to the show. And a very important aspect of Islam is having a will, and we know that Islam places great emphasis on having a will. The inheritance is such an important issue. It is specifically stated in the Noble Quran, and this is the reason why we are talking about World's Week 2022. And this morning, with the Association of Muslim Accountants and Lawyers, we joined by Sister Munirah Osman. Sister Munirah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you and your listeners, and shukran for having us on.
Yes, Jummah Mubarak to you, Sister Munirah, and we are talking about World's Week, and one cannot emphasize enough on the importance of having a will. And let us just visit why this week is so important, what is World's Week, the purpose, and also looking at what are the dates for this year.
Okay, shukran for that question. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about what World Week is all about. Annually, and this was initiated by the then Law Society of South Africa, but today it's no longer called the Law Society of South Africa, but the Legal Practice Council, decided to hold a World Week campaign. And this particular campaign is aimed at encouraging the general public to actually consult an attorney and to have a basic will granted. Now, when they decided upon this particular campaign, LPC basically had two objectives in mind. One is they obviously wanted to support and position their membership, which are attorneys, as the premier providers of wills and estate services to the public, and further to improve the image of the profession generally. Clearly, that is the objective coming from the Legal Practice Council. But what this objective is actually achieving in terms of the community at large is a huge impact in terms of raising awareness around having to ensure that you have a will, one, and also to understand what are some of the ramifications, the details, etc., of the will. So this particular exercise is to encourage all of us as a community to seek some kind of assistance, to seek some kind of advice, and ask the legal experts in terms of what needs to be done, what kind of a will we should draw up, etc. For this year, World's Week is starting on Monday, and it will run from the 12th up until Friday, which is the 17th. So it's the 12th of September to the 17th of September. And you'll find that there are lots of activities that will be taking place during the week.
Sister Munirah, what is the importance of executing a will?
Okay, so I think to answer that question, let me explain a situation where there is no will and what happens when there is no will. And drawing from that, I will then explain why it is important to actually draw a will. Well, I'm going to talk specifically firstly in terms of the South African scenario. So in South Africa, if a person passes away without having drawn up a will, we refer to that estate as an intestate estate, basically meaning that there's no testamentary writing regarding that estate, and hence the term intestate estate. Now, what that basically means is that when that person dies, we need to figure out what are we going to do with all the assets, debts, everything that was a responsibility of the deceased person. And in terms of the Interstate Succession Act, that is the act which regulates what happens to a person's estate who has passed on without leaving a will. That particular act tells us in detail how the person's estate is going to be distributed upon his death or her death because they have not left a will. So in short, what it means is that if you do not make a will, then you are allowing the Interstate Succession Act to be applied to your estate, and therefore it will be distributed according to that. So what you've basically done is you've removed your choice in this whole situation. So therefore, it comes to answering the question, what then is the importance of a will. And as you stated in your introduction, that the importance of having a will cannot be stressed enough. So what are all the things that the will does? It firstly ensures that upon death of an individual, that particular person's assets are dealt with and distributed in accordance with his or her last wishes. So that choice issue. And in South Africa, we're very fortunate in this respect in that we have a concept which is called freedom of testation, which basically means that you are free to leave your estate as you will. Nothing in the law stops you from writing in your will that I want to leave all my assets to my pet cats. Absurd as that might seem, but that is the situation. And in that lies a very, very important aspect for Muslims in South Africa, because in that concept of freedom of gestation gives the Muslim community a choice to make a will which is in accordance with Islamic law. And so in the case of Muslims then, who are living in South Africa, and clearly South Africa, it is a non-Islamic country, we know that in terms of international standards, it is imperative on us as Muslims to make an Islamic will. And this particular concept in South Africa actually allows us that window. So we can actually make an Islamic will instead of just making a will that estate will be distributed according to our personal wishes. And we also know of the tradition and the saying of our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is reported to have said, it is not permissible any Muslim who has anything to will that he may pass even 2 nights without having his will drawn up and kept him. So that hadith in itself really emphasizes the importance of a will for a Muslim person. Shukran.
Also looking at the requirements for having a valid will, I think this is absolutely critical because we find in many instances wills are actually being challenged because they are not valid, Sister Munirah.
Yeah, you're very correct, brother. Well, the wills are regulated again in terms of a particular piece of legislation, which is the Wills Act. And so in this act, there's a whole lot of requirements that have been set about. And so when we do draft a will, we have to be very, very careful about ensuring that we have, in fact, complied with the requirements as per the legislation. So I will not be able to go through all of the requirements, but some of the more important ones I think I can touch on this morning, if you will allow me to.
Yes, please.
So for example, a person must be over the age of 16 years old to make a will. And of course, that comes with the question of the status of a person. Are you a minor? Are you a major, etc.? And so while the law states that at the age of 18, you're a major and an adult, but in terms of this particular piece of legislation, it's allowing you the opportunity to, at the age of 16, to draft a will. Secondly, the will must be in writing. And that record is very, very important. And then again, to draw on our Muslim heritage again, even there's testimony to this fact that whatever contract, it is preferable to reduce it to writing. So again, your will is quite an important instrument, which should not just be an oral or testamentary wish, but it should be reduced to writing, and this is what the law is saying. And then a very important requirement is that the will must be signed on each page, but not only by the person making the will, but also by the 2 witnesses. And the witnesses are not witnessing the content of the will. Lots of people must understand what the role of the witnesses are. The witnesses are merely witnessing the fact it is this particular person who is signing off on the will. So that's an important requirement. And again, who can be witnesses in a will? The witnesses have to be independent. And what's important about who the witnesses are, so if you are a beneficiary in the will, you cannot be a witness in that will. And it makes sense because you could be having some kind of influence over the person who's making the will and hence also sign off as a witness, and then that will can be challenged for an irregularity in terms of this requirement. And witnesses over the age of 18 persons over the age of 14 are allowed to be witnesses in this particular instance. Now, the will has to be dated, a very, very important requirement. Clearly, if the will is not dated, then we do not know whether this will was actually drawn up in the lifetime of the deceased. And you might find that a bit strange or funny, but we have had instances where a will was fished out for a deceased person out of nowhere, and you realize that in fact the will was made fraudulently, obviously, post the death of the person. So the date on that particular document is very, very important, and it has to be stated in clearly. If it is not stated, then again, the will might not be able to hold unless there's a whole lot of witnesses that can say that there was an error, etc. But it has to be dated. Any alterations on the will, so this is again another very, very important aspect. So sometimes you decide to change your mind, or might be that you want to put something else in, etc. Any alteration also has to be initialed by the testator as well as the two witnesses who are witnessing. Now, sometimes we find a situation where a person is unable to actually execute a signature for various different reasons. Maybe they have just not been able to write for their lifetimes, or that they are ill, or various other reasons. Then you could obtain a signature by a thumbprint or a mark with an X. It's permissible, but that has to be supported by an accompanying certificate from a commissioner of oath. So that particular instance, you can't just have the mark or the thumbprint and the witnesses. You would also have to have a certificate by a commissioner of oath. And of course, if you're drawing up an Islamic will, then these requirements will also have to be met in terms of the Islamic will as well, because you're framing that particular will within the legal framework in South Africa. But some other additional things that we must bear in mind when we're executing an Islamic will. In an Islamic will, we do not name the beneficiaries. And there's a very, very important reason why we do not name the beneficiaries, or heirs as you may call them. Because at the time that you are drawing up your will, your Islamic will, you do not know which of your heirs and beneficiaries are going to be alive at the time of your death. So you cannot. What some people do is they say that should these heirs be alive at the time of my death, these are the proportions in which they would inherit. But that is only to say that that's a guide. That's not the actual direction in terms of how. So the heirs are only determined at the time of the death. And you cannot, so Islamic law, there's certain particular primary heirs that will always inherit from the will. But you are allowed to grant a bequest to the amount of 1/3 of your estate. But that 1/3 or that bequest cannot be added on to those who are already heirs. That goes to a separate group of people altogether. Okay. And we must bear in mind that in that 1/3 bequest amount, that is where you also can put in all your charitable donations, what you owe in terms of fasting, if you want somebody to perform a Hajj for you, etc. All of that will form part of the 1/3.
Yes, and also, Sister Munirah, I think what is important is the appointment of an executor, an appropriate executor, because this is a huge responsibility. It's an amana, it is a trust that you are giving to the executor in terms of making sure that the distribution takes place in accordance with what is contained in the will, and more importantly, even looking at it from a Sharia perspective, that is got to be 100% according to Sharia.
Absolutely. You raise a very, very important question. When choosing an executor, we must be able to choose somebody, not only somebody who has skills in this respect, not so much skills, but a little bit of knowledge, but not just knowledge too. You have to find somebody who's going to be able to facilitate good communication between the heirs. We all know, and I think at some point or the other, an attorney, for those of us who practice out there, administration of estates is when you really see the animal in people. I say this all the time. There are two instances when we see the animal in people. When you're dealing with a divorce matter and when you're dealing with estates. And somehow or the other, money is always the root of an evil nature in person. So I think that it is very important, in addition to knowing that this is somebody the family trusts, you can rely on them, because we must look back to what is the role of the executor. Now, the executor is the one who's going to be communicating with the attorneys as well as the heirs, etc. The executor is the one that is going to be signing off on all the official documentation, etc. And should there be some important decisions to be made on the estate, the executor is the one who makes those decisions. So we must be very, very careful about who we nominate as an executor. Sometimes, while we might appoint somebody who we think is going to do a good job in that particular instance, we will not take into account perhaps how will this executor relate to the rest of the heirs, etc. It may not be advantageous to place somebody as an executor who already has, say, a bad relationship with some of the heirs. So very, very careful about that. Another important aspect about appointing an executor is that don't just appoint one executor. So if you do appoint one executor, just put in an alternative. In the instance that so-and-so is unable to up that position, then you always nominate a backup or a second executor.
Yes, and just finally looking at AMAL and activities that have been planned for the week, what are some of those?
Well, AMAL is doing a whole lot of media appearances, and but there are a lot of other activities that lots of other institutions have been engaging in. But mostly what you're going to see panning out next week is lots of sites created where you can actually attend and obtain some free legal advice on how to go about drafting a will. Some attorneys, some organizations are even helping you to draft a will for yourself. Al Baraka, I know, who has partnered with us on many occasions on this, having a week of activities and also providing legal advice. There will be something at the Al Ansar station in Durban. There is lots of activities happening in Cape Town. So lots of things are happening nationally across the country with regard to free legal advice on drafting wills.
Well, Sister Munirah, Jazakallah khairan so much for that, for unpacking what you have with us regarding World's Week and also the extremely important critical issues that we need to know about wills in general. Jazakallah as always, and we appreciate your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran.
Munirah Osman joining us, talking about wills. We're going to go for a break. We come back. It's time for Jumma Nasiha.